I'm kind of worried about something. Here I sit in beautiful San Diego, and we had a magnificent pink magenta sunrise this morning. And here I sit in front of my computer, diddle dorking. So, what worries me is, supposing there is a heaven, and this is a big supposing I make it, and what I spend time in heaven doing is what I'm doing, which is diddle dorking on my computer. That worries me. Okay, so what I want you to think about is I saw this warm and fuzzy video about our Constitution and how we all should read it. And now, what the video neglected it to highlight is that most of the American electorate hate two features of our Constitution that make it a lowercase Constitution. The definition of a Constitution being a body of fundamental principles by which a nation acknowledges itself to be governed. So, first principle is the majority does not rule. The Constitution protects many minority positions from being outvoted. Find me a guy on the street who thinks that is a peachy idea. The very first biggest one that the minority position was protected was the enslavement of people. We wrote it right in there that it would not even get discussed until 1820 because the South knew that they'd be outvoted. And when Benjamin Franklin, contrary to that agreement, began to discuss it, the South said, well, hey, we'll pull back out again. So they've been thinking about pulling out real early. Okay, so then the second feature of our Constitution that I don't think people like is that in the phrase United States of America, the emphasis is on the united at the expense of states. We do not acknowledge states' rights. We fought hard for the unification. During the Revolutionary War and after the Revolutionary War, we had something called the Articles of Confederation that very much acknowledged states' rights, and it was a disaster. We couldn't pay the troops. We didn't pay the troops. We talk about how crappy we treat veterans. See how crappy we treated the veterans of the Revolutionary War, and that's the best we could do because we had Articles of Confederation. We did not have a constitution that created a single unified federal government. The Confederacy, Confederate States of America, they also tried Articles of Confederation instead of a strong union, and it was a disaster for their troops. They couldn't raise taxes, couldn't raise money to pay their troops and to buy supplies. So their men starved and walked around barefooted and carried muskets instead of rifles. So you find me a guy on the street who thinks that it's a good thing that we emphasize a unified, strong federal government over states' rights. So I'm saying the Constitution is not this warm and fuzzy document that everybody loves. It ain't. People don't love it. So here's another thing. The role played by the Supreme Court in the Constitution was not granted. What happened was, in a case called Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court took upon itself the role of declaring whether legislation by Congress was constitutional or not. The Constitution didn't give that power to the Supreme Court. It just took it, and we let it slide. And we have let it slide for 200 years. Thank God. Thank God we let it slide. That's the way it should be. In fact, we should stop pushing democracies around the world. Instead, we should push for constitutional liberalism as interpreted by a Supreme Court, and that we would then provide protection for a Supreme Court from the executive branch and the legislative branch of these different countries. These courts have to have the independent judgment as to whether or not executive action or legislation is constitutional according to their agreed framework. Democracy, rule by the majority, has been a disaster in many countries over many centuries. Our founding fathers were not in favor of democracy. The only democratically elected position was the House of Representatives, and they got short terms, 2 years. Everything else was appointed by governors and state legislatures, appointed by people who knew what the hell was going on and who would be interested in actually serving the long-term future of all of us. You want to think about Hitler was constitutionally elected. Democratically. He was democratically elected. Is it Milosevic, the guy in Serbia? He was popularly elected. Robert Mugabe, terrible dictator, totally screwed his country, popularly elected. Democracy is not what's needed. What's needed is a strong Supreme Court.